The casualty figures, when finally tallied, provided a sobering glimpse into the future of American warfare. Union losses totaled approximately 2,800 men killed, wounded, or missing, while Confederate casualties numbered roughly 2,000. These numbers, modest by later Civil War standards, shocked a nation unaccustomed to industrial-scale violence and convinced leaders on both sides that the conflict would not end quickly or cheaply. Confederate Private James Robertson, of the 4th Alabama Infantry, who had begun the day worrying about impressing his sweetheart back home, now sat exhausted among the captured Union equipment scattered across Henry House Hill. The reality of what he had witnessed, American killing American with methodical efficiency, had stripped away his romantic notions of warfare and replaced them with a mature understanding of its true costs. According to contemporary diplomatic dispatches preserved at the British Foreign Office, news of the Union defeat at Bull Run significantly influenced European perceptions of the American conflict, with many observers concluding that Confederate independence was now inevitable. The captured Union artillery pieces stood silent in the evening twilight, their bronze barrels still warm from the day's firing. Confederate soldiers examined these weapons with professional interest, many realizing for the first time the technological sophistication of their opponents. The war would not be won by enthusiasm alone, but would require matching the North's industrial capacity with Southern tactical innovation and determination. General Johnston's decision to reinforce Beauregard by railroad had demonstrated the strategic importance of Confederate interior lines and the crucial role that railroads would play throughout the conflict. The ability to rapidly shift forces between threatened points would become a defining characteristic of Confederate strategy, compensating partially for their numerical disadvantage through superior mobility and coordination. In Washington, the defeated Union Army struggled to maintain any semblance of organization as demoralized soldiers sought food, water, and medical attention. Many regiments had lost more than half their strength to casualties, desertion, and simple confusion. The volunteer system that had seemed so democratic and American now revealed its weaknesses when compared to the professional military traditions that many Confederate officers had maintained. The battle's aftermath would trigger fundamental changes in how both sides approached the conflict. The Union would begin the massive mobilization of industrial resources that would eventually prove decisive, while the Confederacy would develop the tactical expertise and fighting spirit that would sustain their cause for 4 more years of increasingly desperate struggle. As darkness fell over Bull Run, the creek continued flowing toward the Potomac, its waters now carrying the blood of Americans who had learned that civil war was not a grand adventure, but a national tragedy requiring unprecedented sacrifice. The age of American innocence had ended at Henry House Hill, replaced by a mature understanding that freedom's preservation would demand a price measured in lives rather than rhetoric. The first battle was over, but the war had truly begun. The morning mist clung to the Virginia countryside like a shroud of innocence about to be torn away forever. It was July 21st, 1861, and the United States of America stood on the precipice of discovering that civil war was not the romantic adventure both North and South had imagined it would be. Brigadier General Irvin McDowell adjusted his field glasses and surveyed the rolling hills near Manassas Junction. His 35,000 Union troops had marched from Washington with the confidence of men who believed they would crush the rebellion in a single decisive blow. Behind them, carriages filled with curious spectators from the capital had followed, expecting to witness a grand theatrical performance rather than the birth of America's bloodiest conflict. The Confederate forces, numbering roughly 22,000 under Brigadier General Pierre-Gustave Toutant Beauregard, had positioned themselves along Bull Run Creek. Beauregard, a Louisiana Creole with piercing dark eyes and a meticulously waxed mustache, understood better than his Union counterpart that this battle would determine not just military supremacy, but the very soul of a fractured nation. As referenced in historical accounts from the National Archives, the strategic importance of Manassas Junction cannot be overstated. It represented the crucial railroad hub that could either secure Confederate supply lines or open the path to Richmond for Union forces. The Confederate soldiers, many still wearing their militia uniforms from various states, worked frantically to strengthen their defensive positions along the creek. Private James Robertson of the 4th Alabama Infantry wiped sweat from his brow as he helped position a 12-pound Napoleon cannon. At 19, he had enlisted with dreams of glory and tales to tell his sweetheart back in Montgomery. The reality of impending battle, however, had begun to settle like lead in his stomach. Across the creek, Union Colonel Ambrose Everett Burnside marshaled his Rhode Island regiment, their pristine blue uniforms still unmarked by the harsh realities of campaign life. The men joked nervously, their laughter carrying across the morning air with an edge of hysteria. They had been told this would be a simple matter: march south, scatter the rebels, and return home as heroes in time for harvest. McDowell's battle plan seemed sound on paper. A diversionary attack at Stone Bridge would pin down Confederate forces, while the main Union assault would cross Bull Run at Sudley Ford, flanking Beauregard's left wing. It was a classic military maneuver, one taught in the halls of West Point, where both commanders had once walked as cadets, never imagining they would face each other across a battlefield divided by ideology rather than nationality. The Confederate signal station atop the Henry House Hill had been tracking Union movement since dawn. Captain Edward Porter Alexander, the young signal officer, had developed an innovative system using wig-wag flags to communicate across vast distances. His messages crackled through the humid air like lightning, carrying intelligence that would prove crucial in the hours to come. As the sun climbed higher, burning away the protective mist, both armies prepared for what they believed would be a brief, decisive encounter. Neither side understood that they were about to participate in the opening act of a tragedy that would consume over 600,000 American lives before its conclusion. The age of American innocence was drawing to a close, and Bull Run Creek would serve as its grave marker. At 5:30 in the morning, the first cannon shot shattered the Virginia stillness like the crack of divine judgment. Captain Charles Griffin's battery had opened fire on the Stone Bridge, and with that thunderous proclamation, the American Civil War began in earnest. The reverberations rolled across the countryside, startling birds from their roosts and sending rabbits scurrying through the underbrush. For many soldiers on both sides, it was the first time they had heard artillery fire in anger, and the sound struck them with an almost physical force that seemed to compress their lungs and quicken their hearts to a frantic rhythm. Confederate Colonel Nathan George Evans, a rough-hewn South Carolinian known to his men as Shanks for his peculiar gait, commanded the forces at Stone Bridge. A West Point graduate with a reputation for hard drinking and harder fighting, Evans quickly recognized McDowell's diversionary tactic. Unlike many of his contemporaries who might have been deceived by the feint, Evans possessed an intuitive understanding of battlefield dynamics that would serve the Confederacy well this day. The Union artillery bombardment continued for nearly 2 hours, filling the air with acrid smoke and the screaming whistle of shot and shell. Confederate soldiers pressed themselves against earthworks and behind trees, feeling the ground tremble beneath them with each impact. Private Thomas Cartwright of the 8th Georgia wrote in his diary that the sound was like all the demons of hell had been unleashed upon the earth. Meanwhile, McDowell's main flanking force, consisting of approximately 13,000 men under the command of Brigadier General Daniel Tyler and Colonel David Hunter, began their circuitous march toward Sudley Ford. The route was longer and more treacherous than anticipated, winding through dense woods and across rocky terrain that seemed designed to exhaust men before battle had even been properly joined. As documented in contemporary military dispatches housed at the Library of Congress, communication failures began to plague both armies almost immediately, setting a pattern that would characterize much of the early war period. Hunter's division, Leading the flanking movement included the 2nd Rhode Island Infantry under Colonel John Slocum and the 71st New York Infantry, composed largely of recent immigrants who had volunteered to prove their American loyalty. These men stumbled through the pre-dawn darkness, their equipment jangling and their breathing labored as they struggled to maintain formation over unfamiliar ground. Captain Alexander's Confederate signal station detected the Union movement around 7 in the morning. His wigwag messages flashed urgently across the landscape. Large body of enemy crossing at Sudley Ford. The intelligence reached General Beauregard at his headquarters near Mitchell's Ford, but the Confederate commander initially dismissed it as a minor demonstration, believing the main Union assault would come at his center. It was Colonel Evans who grasped the true situation first. Leaving only a handful of companies to maintain the illusion of defending Stone Bridge, he marched the bulk of his command, approximately 1,100 men, northwest to meet Hunter's flanking force. This bold decision demonstrated the kind of tactical flexibility that would characterize the best Confederate commanders throughout the war. The terrain around Sudley Ford presented unique challenges for both attackers and defenders. Rolling hills covered with thick stands of oak and pine created natural defensive positions while simultaneously providing concealment for advancing troops. Small streams and gullies crisscrossed the landscape, offering additional obstacles that would fragment formations and complicate tactical coordination. As Hunter's men finally crossed Bull Run at Sudley Ford around 9:30, they encountered Evans's hastily formed defensive line on Matthews Hill. The sight of Confederate battle flags snapping in the morning breeze sent a shock of reality through Union ranks. This would not be the unopposed march to Richmond they had envisioned, but a genuine contest of arms against determined opponents fighting for their homeland. The first volleys erupted with devastating effect, and men began falling with startling regularity, their cries adding a human counterpoint to the mechanical violence of musketry and artillery. The collision of armies on Matthews Hill erupted with the savage intensity of a thunderstorm breaking against mountain peaks. Union forces, stretched thin from their extended march and disoriented by the morning's confusion, found themselves facing determined Confederate resistance where none had been expected. Colonel Nathan Evans had positioned his men along the crest of Matthews Hill with the tactical acumen of a seasoned warrior. His force, though outnumbered more than 10-1, held the crucial advantage of defensive ground and interior lines of communication. The 1st South Carolina Infantry, composed of Charleston aristocrats and backcountry farmers, united in their determination to resist Northern aggression, anchored his left flank. Major Roberto Wheat's Louisiana Tigers, a colorful battalion of New Orleans dock workers, riverboat men, and soldiers of fortune, held the center. These rough-hewn men, many sporting elaborate mustaches and carrying Bowie knives alongside their muskets, had earned their fearsome reputation in the Mexican War. Their battle cry, a wild mixture of French Creole curses and rebel yells, struck Union ears like the howling of wolves. Confederate General Joseph Eggleston, Johnston's Valley Army, began arriving via railroad from the Shenandoah Valley around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The sight of fresh Southern troops deploying from the Manassas Gap railroad cars sent shockwaves through Union ranks, who had been told that Johnston's force was too far away to affect the battle. This intelligence failure would prove catastrophic to Federal hopes for victory. Brigadier General Edmund Kirby Smith's brigade marched directly from the rail cars into battle, their rifles still carrying the dust of the Valley campaigns. Smith himself fell wounded almost immediately, struck down by Union sharpshooters as he attempted to deploy his regiments. Command passed to Colonel Arnold Elzey, a Maryland native fighting for the Confederacy, despite his state's nominal loyalty to the Union. As documented in the official records of the Union and Confederate armies, the arrival of Johnston's reinforcements fundamentally altered the tactical balance. transforming what had been a potential Union victory into an increasingly desperate situation for Federal commanders. The confusion of battle reached nightmarish proportions as units from both sides became hopelessly intermingled. The smoke from thousands of black powder muskets created a dense fog that reduced visibility to mere yards, forcing soldiers to identify friend from foe by uniform details visible only at point-blank range. Tragic incidents of friendly fire began occurring with increasing frequency, as nervous men fired at shadows and movement rather than clearly identified targets. Colonel Francis Sherman Bartow of the 8th Georgia Infantry led his regiment in a flanking movement around the Union right, his men moving through the dense woods like ghosts in gray uniforms. Bartow, a prominent Savannah lawyer who had served in the Georgia Secession Convention, embodied the political passion that had driven the South to war. His death, struck down by a Union musket ball while positioning his men for attack, symbolized the price Southern leadership would pay for their convictions. Union artillery, commanded by Captain Romaine Beck Ayres, attempted to establish a defensive line on the Warrenton Turnpike, but Confederate infantry had begun infiltrating between Federal units, creating gaps that threatened to split the Union Army. The psychological pressure of fighting an enemy that seemed to appear from every direction began telling on Northern morale, which had already been shaken by the unexpected strength of Confederate resistance. Private David Hunter Strother, of the 3rd West Virginia Infantry, serving as a scout for General Patterson, observed the developing crisis with growing alarm. In letters to his family that would later be published in Harper's Weekly, he described the transformation of confident soldiers into desperate men fighting for survival rather than political principle. The heat, combined with the physical and emotional strain of continuous combat, began producing casualties from causes other than enemy action. Men collapsed from heat exhaustion, their uniforms soaked with sweat and their faces flushed with fever. Water supplies, already limited, became contaminated with gunpowder residue and blood, forcing soldiers to choose between dehydration and illness. As the afternoon wore on, the initiative began shifting definitively toward the Confederates, whose local knowledge and defensive positions gradually overcame Union numerical superiority. As the Confederate counterattack gained momentum, what began as an orderly Union withdrawal quickly degenerated into something far more dangerous and humiliating. The sight of fresh Confederate reinforcements streaming onto the battlefield, combined with the exhaustion of Federal troops who had been fighting since dawn, created conditions ripe for psychological collapse. The disaster began when Colonel Israel Bush Richardson's brigade attempted to conduct a fighting withdrawal from Henry House Hill. Richardson, a Vermont-born regular Army officer with Mexican War experience, understood the complex choreography required to disengage from close combat while maintaining unit cohesion. However, his orders became confused in transmission, and what should have been a tactical retreat became a disorganized scramble for safety. The 71st New York Infantry, composed largely of recent immigrants desperate to prove their American loyalty, found themselves abandoned when supporting units withdrew without warning. Surrounded on three sides by advancing Confederates, the regiment's colonel ordered his men to surrender rather than face annihilation. The sight of Federal troops laying down their arms sent shockwaves through nearby Union units, many of whom concluded that the battle was lost and began retreating without orders. Captain William Farquhar Berry's artillery reserve attempted to cover the withdrawal, unlimbering their guns along the Warrenton Turnpike and firing canister rounds into pursuing Confederate infantry. The deadly hail of metal balls temporarily slowed the Southern advance, but ammunition supplies were running critically low, and Confederate sharpshooters were systematically eliminating gun crews from concealed positions. General McDowell rode desperately between his disintegrating units, attempting to rally men who had lost faith in both their commanders and their mission. His horse had been shot from under him twice, and his uniform bore the stains of gunpowder and blood from wounded soldiers he had stopped to assist. The transformation from confident invasion to desperate retreat had occurred with stunning rapidity, as referenced in contemporary accounts preserved at the National Archives. The presence of civilian spectators from Washington created additional complications as panic-stricken politicians and society ladies fled alongside retreating soldiers, their carriages clogging roads needed for military evacuation. Confederate cavalry under Colonel James Ewell Brown. Stuart began harassing the Union retreat, their sabers flashing in the afternoon sunlight as they charged isolated Federal units. Stuart, a flamboyant Virginian who wore a peacock feather in his hat and sang while leading charges, embodied the romantic image of Confederate horsemen that would capture popular imagination throughout the war. The stone bridge over Bull Run, which had been the focus of the morning's diversionary attack, became a fatal bottleneck as thousands of retreating Federal soldiers converged on the single crossing point. Confederate artillery, hastily repositioned by Captain John Pelham's battery, began shelling the bridge approaches, creating additional panic among men already demoralized by defeat. Brigadier General Robert Patterson's division, which had been held in reserve throughout the battle, attempted to cover the general retreat, but found themselves fighting a series of rearguard actions against Confederate units that seemed to multiply like Hydra heads. Every hill and wood line concealed enemy soldiers, and the psychological pressure of fighting an invisible foe began breaking the nerve of even veteran troops. The civilian spectators who had come from Washington to witness what they expected to be a grand Federal victory now found themselves caught in a military disaster of unprecedented proportions. Senators and congressmen abandoned their carriages and fled on foot, their formal attire incongruous amid the chaos of military retreat. Newspaper correspondents who had planned to file triumphant dispatches instead found themselves documenting national humiliation. Private Warren Lee Goss of the 1st Massachusetts Infantry later wrote that the retreat from Bull Run resembled the biblical flight from Sodom and Gomorrah, with every man convinced that divine punishment was pursuing him. Personally, the metaphor was apt, as many Union soldiers believed they were being punished for their earlier confidence and boastful predictions of easy victory. The July heat, combined with dust, kicked up by thousands of marching feet and wagon wheels, created almost unbearable conditions for men already exhausted by 12 hours of combat. Soldiers discarded equipment to lighten their loads, leaving a trail of muskets, knapsacks, and personal possessions that would later be collected by Confederate scavengers seeking to supply their own poorly equipped forces. By evening, the roads leading back to Washington resembled a scene from Dante's Inferno more than a military retreat. Federal soldiers, civilian spectators, politicians, and journalists streamed northward in a confused mass that bore no resemblance to the confident army that had marched south just days before. The transformation was so complete that many observers struggled to believe they were witnessing the same men who had departed the capital with such fanfare and optimism. General Beauregard chose not to pursue the retreating Union forces with his full strength, a decision that would be debated by military historians for generations. The Confederate commander cited the exhaustion of his own troops, the approaching darkness, and the need to consolidate his victory rather than risk overextension. Critics would later argue that a vigorous pursuit might have captured Washington itself and ended the war before it truly began. President Abraham Lincoln received news of the defeat in the White House telegraph office, where he had spent much of the day anxiously monitoring reports from the battlefield. The tall, angular president absorbed the magnitude of the disaster with characteristic stoicism, though witnesses noted that his face seemed to age years in the span of minutes as the full implications became clear. The opening Confederate volley tore through Hunter's advancing division with deadly precision. Men who had been joking and singing moments before suddenly crumpled to the earth, their blue uniforms blooming crimson in the Virginia sunshine. Reality of warfare struck the Union ranks with sobering force. This was not a parade ground demonstration, but a deadly contest where hesitation meant death. Captain James Ricketts brought his battery Weir, 1st United States Artillery, into action, unlimbering his 6 guns on a slight rise overlooking the Confederate position. His veteran gunners worked with mechanical precision, loading and firing with a steady rhythm that sent shot and shells screaming into Evans's line. The impact of exploding shells splintered trees and sent deadly fragments whistling through the air like angry wasps. Private William Tecumseh Sherman's brother, a corporal in the 71st New York, fell with a musket ball through his chest during the first exchange of infantry fire. His final words, shouted above the din of battle, were reportedly, "Tell mother I died facing the enemy." Such personal tragedy began to multiply across the field as the morning wore on, each fallen soldier representing not just a military casualty, but a family destroyed and dreams forever shattered. As detailed in battlefield reports preserved at the Smithsonian Institution, the fighting on Matthews Hill demonstrated the deadly effectiveness of rifled muskets in the hands of determined defenders, foreshadowing the horrific casualty rates that would characterize the entire conflict. Confederate reinforcements began arriving piecemeal as Evans's urgent messages reached other commands. The 4th South Carolina Infantry double-timed across the countryside, their colonel exhorting them to remember the honor of the Palmetto State. Behind them came scattered companies from Virginia regiments, their officers shouting contradictory orders as they struggled to deploy their men effectively in the growing chaos. Union commanders found themselves caught between tactical necessity and political reality. The pressure to advance quickly and seize Richmond before Confederate forces could consolidate warred against the military wisdom of careful preparation and coordinated assault. Politicians in Washington had demanded immediate action, and their influence could be felt even here on the battlefield, where such considerations should have been irrelevant. The battle raged across Matthews Hill for nearly 2 hours, with neither side able to gain decisive advantage. Confederate ammunition began running low, forcing soldiers to search the cartridge boxes of fallen comrades. Union forces, though better supplied, struggled with coordination problems as different regiments became intermingled in the confusion of combat. Captain Griffin's artillery battery had advanced to within 300 yards of the Confederate line, close enough for gunners to see individual enemy faces. The psychological pressure of such proximity began telling on both sides, as men realized they were killing neighbors and former countrymen rather than foreign invaders. Yet the momentum of battle, once started, proved difficult to stop. Blood soaked into the Virginia soil, beginning the transformation of America from a nation of optimistic expansion into one acquainted with grief and loss on an industrial scale. By noon, the battle had shifted southward to Henry House Hill, where 85-year-old Judith Carter, Henry lay bedridden in her modest frame house, too frail to be evacuated despite her family's pleas. The widow had lived through the Revolution, witnessed the birth of the Republic, and now would become the conflict's first civilian casualty when an artillery shell tore through her bedroom, ending a life that had spanned America's transformation, from colonial rebellion to civil war. General Beauregard had finally grasped the true nature of McDowell's assault and began shifting Confederate forces to meet the Union flanking movement. Brigadier General Thomas Jonathan Jackson's Virginia Brigade marched steadily toward the sound of the guns, their ranks dressed with parade ground precision despite the urgency of their mission. Jackson himself, a former mathematics professor at Virginia Military Institute, rode with characteristic calm, his blue eyes scanning the tactical situation with scientific detachment. The Confederate reinforcements arrived at a critical moment, when Evans's battered command was beginning to falter under relentless Union pressure. Fresh regiments poured onto Henry House Hill, their battle flags streaming in the humid air as officers shouted commands and tried to establish coherent defensive lines. The confusion was immense. Units from different states using different drill manuals, officers who had never worked together attempting to coordinate complex maneuvers under fire. Captain John Imboden's Staunton artillery unlimbered their guns, on the reverse slope of Henry House Hill, protected from direct Union observation but perfectly positioned to deliver enfilading fire against advancing Federal troops. Imboden, a lawyer-turned-soldier, directed his battery with the same methodical precision he had once applied to legal briefs, calculating ranges and adjusting elevations with deadly accuracy. Union forces pressed their assault with renewed vigor, sensing victory within their grasp. The 14th Brooklyn Infantry, wearing their distinctive red trousers and white gaiters, advanced in perfect formation despite the growing carnage around them. These men, many of them recent German immigrants, had drilled extensively in New York's Prospect Park and now put their training to the ultimate test. The battle reached its crescendo when Union artillery under Captain Charles Griffin and Captain James Ricketts advanced to within 70 yards of Jackson's line. Such close-range artillery work was extraordinarily dangerous, requiring gunners to work exposed to enemy fire while Confederate sharpshooters systematically picked off crew members. The guns barked continuously, their muzzle flashes creating small thunderstorms of smoke and flame. According to military historians whose research is preserved in the Virginia Historical Society archives, it was at this moment that Jackson earned his famous nickname when Brigadier General Barnard B. allegedly shouted, "There is Jackson standing like a stone wall." The Virginia Brigade held firm against repeated Union assaults, their disciplined volleys breaking up attack after attack. Confederate Colonel Arthur Cummings' Corse led the 17th Virginia Infantry in a desperate charge to recapture Ricketts' guns. The Virginians advanced with fixed bayonets, their battle cry echoing across the hillside as they closed with Union defenders. Hand-to-hand combat erupted around the artillery pieces, men grappling with musket butts and bayonets in a savage struggle that epitomized the personal nature of this fratricidal conflict. The Union 11th New York Infantry, composed largely of New York City firemen known as the Fire Zouaves for their distinctive red uniforms and fezes, found themselves caught in a deadly crossfire between Confederate infantry and artillery. Their colonel, Elmer Ephraim Ellsworth, had been killed weeks earlier in Alexandria, and now his men faced annihilation far from the familiar streets of Manhattan. Private Elisha Hunt Rhodes of the 2nd Rhode Island Infantry wrote in his diary that the noise on Henry House Hill was beyond human description, a continuous roar of musketry punctuated by the thunder of artillery that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. Men pressed handkerchiefs to their ears and still found themselves temporarily deafened by the cacophony of industrial warfare. As afternoon shadows began lengthening across the battlefield, both armies teetered on the edge of exhaustion, their initial enthusiasm replaced by grim determination to survive the increasingly hellish conditions. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on Henry House Hill as the battle entered its most critical phase. Union forces had captured and lost Ricketts's and Griffin's artillery batteries multiple times, with Confederate and Federal troops alternately charging across the blood-soaked ground in desperate attempts to seize the tactical advantage these guns represented. Bodies in blue and gray uniforms lay intermingled around the silent cannon, testament to the savage nature of the fighting. General McDowell, recognizing that his flanking movement had stalled, committed his reserves in a final push to break Confederate resistance. The 1st Michigan Infantry advanced in column formation, their officers mounted and sabers drawn in the traditional style of Napoleonic warfare. These men from the Great Lakes region had never experienced the humidity and heat of a Virginia summer, and many began falling from exhaustion even before Confederate bullets found their marks. Colonel William Tecumseh Sherman led his brigade in a supporting attack, his red hair streaming beneath his slouch hat as he urged his men forward. The future architect of total warfare was learning his trade here on the slopes of Henry House Hill, absorbing lessons about the brutal efficiency of modern weapons that he would later apply with devastating effect against Confederate cities and supply lines.